When you need a lawyer, how do you find the right one? Contact the Chicago Bar Association.
Whether you've been injured or need a will prepared, whether you're buying a home or starting a business, having the right lawyer is essential. The Chicago Bar Association have lawyers who practice in most areas of law and speak a variety of languages.
Don't leave it to chance. Get a referral to a screened, experienced lawyer. Visit chicagobar.org or call 312-554-2001. The Chicago Bar Association. Se habla español.
Welcome to You and the Law, a Chicago Bar Association production focused on issues of law and policy. We have, and this is public facing. It's not for lawyers only. It's for everybody. We have with us two excellent lawyers who practice in a variety of different areas. But our topic today is going to be, or is, immigration and due process, and essentially all the civil rights and constitutional law issues that are implicated by a lot of what's going on today. We have with us John Heiderscheidt, who practices in a variety of areas, including immigration, and has great in-depth knowledge. And the same is true also for Aasim Cunningham, who's with us. And I'd like them both to introduce themselves. I'm Mike Alkaraki, the host of this show and other shows. And John, why don't we start with you with a little bit of background, please?
Mike, thank you so much for having me. My name is John Heiderscheidt. I am the owner of Heiderscheidt Law Group, which has a DBA as subscription lawyer, and we represent predominantly immigrant clients across the United States, but mostly out of Chicago. We also handle some criminal defense matters and some selective civil cases as well. We're on the north side of Chicago, and I've been an attorney for, it'll be 15 years this year, I think.
Great, thank you very much. And Aasim, who is also the chair of the Media Production Committee, among other things, can you share a little bit about your background and substantive practice areas?
Absolutely. Aasim Cunningham at Cunningham Lopez LLP. As a firm, we practice a great deal of immigration law. I myself am not in the nuts and bolts, but I do handle many of the related matters, including civil rights, probate, and family law, which connects a great deal with the immigration matters.
Great, thank you very much. So we can start anywhere you like, really. I'll just share some very general basic thoughts that kind of harken back to a couple conversations, we've all had independently or, as a group together. But we are, as we talk about immigration and due process, it's hard to really have that conversation limited to those things because they implicate civil rights, constitutional law, democracy, liberalism is a political and moral philosophy, and certainly rule of law, which I think our focus will be, of course, on rule of law. But it encompasses so much, and there's so much to talk about, and so much is happening every day through executive orders, opinions, Supreme Court opinions that we're expecting, and have already occurred, and the immigration entry point is probably just a good place, so to speak, and pardon any pun. I mean, there's really not much that's funny about what's going on right now. It's quite concerning for lawyers, and more importantly for people in our country, and in the state of our democracy, really. And John, why don't you share with us any place you want to start? We've talked about so many things. Pick one and let's get rolling.
Well, how about we start at the tip of the iceberg, which is due process.
Sure.
And there's now an open question or several open questions about what level of process is due to an immigrant who's in the United States that the sitting administration would want to remove or feels there's cause to remove. And traditionally, what process has been owed has been somewhat tethered to your right to enter the country in the first place. A term that is used quite often in immigration law is EWI, EWI, which is enter without inspection. And that somebody who is EWI is in a completely different situation than somebody who entered on a B2 visitor visa that allowed them to come into the country and stay for 2 years, but then they overstayed, and so they're out of status, but they had a status when they walked in or came in.
Mhm.
And then there's another example is a green card holder, and that's pretty close to citizenship. You're about a step away usually, and you enjoy many of the panoply of rights that citizens enjoy. However, there are some restrictions, and you still have to go through a process to naturalize to become a citizen. So, some of the process that you're owed, or at least the way the Supreme Court has looked at it in the past, has been dependent on how you came in. I'll be really interested to see. I think this Supreme Court is going to lend a lot of definition and put ceilings and basements in place with regards to removal proceedings that they haven't felt the need to address before.
Mhm.
And that's probably because of the aggressive nature with which the administration is pursuing matters of immigration and particularly removable aliens or immigrants to the United States. So, when we think of the United States, we think of what sets it apart as due process. And what we're not seeing is, I mean, when you see people who are just put onto a plane and shipped out in defiance of existing court orders, and certain members of the administration making comments that harken back to the days of Marshall has made his decision, let him enforce it. We're on different ground and we're on new ground. And I think all lawyers have to be aware of this because even though it's happening in the niche of immigration, the spillover of these principles is eventually going to come into every area of practice.
Absolutely. Let me share, and I want to turn to Aasim too to follow up on that. But I'll share, obviously the U.S. Constitution and the Fifth and 14th Amendment guarantee due process, which of course we're talking about foundational principles and values of democratic constitutional democracy, or however you want to kind of conceptualize that. But whether it's procedural or substantive, they operate together. And there is, I think, a misconception that some of what's going on right now should be of less concern to citizens or naturalized residents, but without question we see a diminution of due process, which there's no, I think, reliable basis to think that it would stop there. And even if there were, it is nonetheless incumbent upon lawyers in particular to address it there, even if it doesn't affect U.S. citizens. So there is colloquially a great hustle afoot, and it's up to the lawyers to be saying stuff about this. With that, I'm going to turn it to Aasim for some thoughts.
So this current issue with immigration and how the current administration is really testing the boundaries of the separations of power in the Constitution makes me think of that saying, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes.
Mhm.
And there have been several reiterations of instances where an administration may take a policy to its furthest limits um, under some guise that may not be explicit to the public.
Right.
For example, in the 90s, there was the war on drugs, which led to a lot of stop and seizures, stop and frisk, unlawful searches. And what it creates is pretext, which comes up in many contexts of the law, a pretext for law enforcement or the administration to inspect and abuse someone's right to privacy and right to, just the enjoyment of their lives in a manner in which they probably shouldn't.
Right.
Think about the Patriot Act in the early 2000s, where that was, again, this attempt at uh, accomplishing, albeit a justified goal, but the overreaching of that, of what the implications meant the intrusions into people's privacy because the government was using it in other instances. And now we have this an administration that potentially could be using immigration as a platform to essentially revoke due process rights to citizens. And what I mean by that is right now there is a priority and there are joint task forces and the like to remove unlawful immigrants. And what that means in the plain language is that we're looking at people and trying to identify who has lawful status. A big issue is that most people don't know what it takes to prove their lawful status in in the United States. A regular citizen could be pulled over in Illinois and present a license, and that would not in and of itself prove that they have lawful status. So
Hmm.
what does that mean? An officer has a hunch at into looking into something else. You all of a sudden say, "Hey, I have a license." They say, "Well, where's your proof of residency, lawful status?" Doesn't matter what we don't know what an immigrant identifies as, and all of a sudden you're being detained for some period of time in order to protect, this illusion of a lawful search or seizure.
Hmm. So I want to hit sort of two broad points, which we actually touched upon on our own conversations offline. That at least from my view, and I do believe it's self-evident. I don't think I have to make an argument for it, but I want to lay it out very simply and kind of humbly because it's kind of a big idea. In fact, I'll start. John, you mentioned that this immigration issue may very well be, and I think you use more direct language than that, probably because we were talking casually. Not offensive at all, but I mean, I think you said flat out, it's the the social justice issue of our generation, and that's such a heavy statement, but it's hard to make an argument that it's not. I mean, I can, we can split hairs and we can look at it different ways, but I think it's substantially true. And I want to tie that into two sort of very simple principles. Sim, you mentioned the Patriot Act. Um, there is embedded, in any kind of foreign expansion type conflict or foreign war, especially in the Middle East, right, which is going on now. Obviously, we had Ukraine too, and have Ukraine going on, but right now that's part of what we're looking at, and it does kind of harken back to the Patriot Act times. And when we are engaged in those foreign endeavors, military endeavors, without question, it's just a matter of dynamics that you will have a corresponding suppression of domestic civil rights. And the Patriot Act, whether the basis or concern for some type of law like that may be legitimate, will almost always, without fail, invite bad actors who are going to take that as an opportunity to pursue whatever interests that are actually not helping our domestic democracy. And I don't want to go too much further with that because it opens up quite a lot. I think that also, when we look at the current administration's escalation on the fronts you discussed, it's helpful to identify that, but it's also critical, I think, to see some of those civil rights suppression movements occurring on a bipartisan basis and without question. I don't want to say starting with the Biden-Harris administration, but absolutely escalated by Biden and Harris prior to Trump, which then escalated again. And we saw that probably most prominently on free speech issues, and also, look, we've got speech issues, we've got free and fair election issues, we've got maybe nothing else signals, this better than Dick Cheney, who was Darth Vader and ought to be Darth Vader still, endorsing Harris. That is a real concern, and it leaves us with real questions about what the Democratic Party is, not to make it political, because it's bipartisan is really the issue, but really what our democracy is all about. So I think we are facing these issues on an escalating basis, but to look at it through a partisan lens will obscure a lot of what's going on. So I think it's important for us, as you did, we've kind of discussed, to kind of, look at the structurally what's happening in terms of free speech, in terms of due process, in terms of civil rights, and that's the lawyer's entry into all this, because we can see it all right there. So with that, let's talk about specific examples of what's going on.
One thing that's going on right now is the litigation around the Alien Enemies Act, and those, for anybody who's not familiar, are pieces of legislation from the John Adams administration, part of the Alien and Sedition Acts, that give or purport to give the executive wide unilateral discretion in who to expel from the country on the basis that they might be part of an enemy nation or an invading nation, or a group that we're at war with. And I think what's so interesting about this is, to piggyback on what you both just said, is this idea of going back to the Patriot Act and the authorization of the use of military force. TDA is not Venezuela. It's a gang faction within Venezuela. MS-13 is a gang faction in many different places, but they're not nations, and I don't know how you would necessarily declare war on them. I'm sure Congress could make a declaration of war on those groups, but what the administration is going to argue is that, or at least I would assume they're going to argue, is that the authorization of use of military force is what vests them, is that's going to be their cover for while we're still in wartime. And it's just the shape of the war and the players in the war have changed.
Right.
But transnational terrorism has moved now from a Middle Eastern thing to a transnational thing. So the argument will go, and you're seeing elements of ISIS integrate with TDA. So the argument will go. And because of that, back in the 2000s, Congress already authorized this kind of action. And I think that'll be one argument on top of whether there's a war or not. Article 2 vests the president with the authority to do this in times of national emergency. And we've already got a national emergency declared. So if you think back on the times that the Supreme Court has sort of checked unilateral executive authority, Youngstown Sheet and Tube, I think when Truman wanted to privatize the one of the industries during the Korean War, and the court said no to that. I think that may be an important decision for lawyers to look at. But in my limited and humble experience, when the government cries national security, the courts kind of tuck and curl up and say okay and do whatever you want to the executive. At least that's what I've seen in my lifetime.
Sure.
And
So,
I
go
think
ahead,
we'll
sorry.
see the how far the court is willing to allow the executive branch to take those national security arguments in this term and the next term.
Sure. So I want to mention, and then I'll turn it over to Aasim. Now, I'd like to get into some specific, situations, whether and just some that you can choose from, whatever you want to talk about. We've got Amir Makled, the pro-Palestinian lawyer who was questioned upon reentry. We've got Mahmoud Khalil, Abrego Garcia, the Alien Enemies Act, which we discussed, birthright citizenship. And a lot of this stuff lays bare a lot of what's going on. And I won't give too much commentary on this, but what's going on right now, and we've got the World Court with opinions on the occupation in Palestine and also the South Africa genocide case. Another thing that relates to the Patriot Act, we heard Netanyahu say straight up, this is Israel's 9/11. Now, what does that mean? That means expansionist war, and we're supporting that. And part of what's going on here, without question, a lot of it is in response to that, or part of that support, in my opinion. I don't want to go too far with that, but when we're doing these expansionist wars, when we're involved in that type of that thinking, we're going to see suppression of civil rights across the board, from free speech, due process, immigration, etc. Aasim, whatever case you want to talk about, let's jump into it because there's so much, and I think we have to be a little bit concise. And I apologize if I'm talking too much. Go ahead.
So John had mentioned the use of the Alien Enemies Act and recognizing these foreign gangs as terrorists. Now, what's interesting is that it could complicate the immigration court's job from the standpoint that one of the things you have to prove, what you have to prove essentially in an asylum case, is that the government or a faction of the government you are a victim of oppression by the government or a government actor. And so if we are using the Alien Enemies Act to remove these gangs, you're recognizing these gangs as state actors. In the past, it has been very difficult, almost as a numbing effect for victims or people filing for asylum to claim that cartels and gangs are who are the culprits of the persecution. Now there's legislation and a policy that almost recognizes them as some sort of state or quasi-state actor, and so it may have the inverse effect, hopefully, in terms of people claiming asylum, moving forward in these next few years.
Sure. Let's get a little bit of factual basis just in terms of anecdotes of what's happened, whether it's Amir Makled, Mahmoud Khalil, Abrigo Garcia. Let's get a little bit of factual background for those who may not be attuned to those.
Sure. So
Anyone?
probably one of the more popular cases that's hitting headlines right now is Kilmar Abrigo Garcia. Kilmar Abrigo Garcia was lawfully present in the United States. He did have an order of removal, meaning that he should have been deported. However, the court in his case ordered a withholding of the removal, which essentially says, we're not giving you the status that you may have requested, whether it be asylum or what have you. However, we are going to allow you to stay lawfully, and you are going to have work authorization. Kilmar was picked up in an ICE raid that was targeted at finding Venezuelan gang members, as John had mentioned. And although he had stated that he has a lawful presence, they still put him on one of the planes that deported him to El Salvador. Under his order of withholding of removal, he should not be sent to his country of origin, because that is precisely the purpose of the order of withholding of removal, which is to protect him from threats in his homeland.
Right. Right. Yeah. John, you want to add something?
Well, I totally agree with the point that was just made, that the great irony of all the actions this administration is taking with regards to foreign gangs. And I'd said to my colleague the other day, we were filing some individual calendar hearing pleadings for somebody who has a removal hearing coming up. And I said, this administration is writing our briefs for us. They're making the argument for asylum for every respondent who comes to these countries 5 times stronger. And I've yet to encounter it, because I haven't done an individual in this Trump administration. I did plenty in the last. But I don't know how the OCCs are going to sit there and argue with a straight face that MS-13 and TDA aren't government actors, when their boss, the president, is writing executive orders saying they're foreign terrorist organizations that run their countries.
Right.
And so I could not agree more strongly with that point about the irony there. The one that I find really interesting is the lawyer who was stopped in Michigan, and somebody will have to give me the name, but
I think that's Amir McLeod.
Yeah, that's the one that's really interesting to me right now as an attorney, because I've never practiced in an environment where law enforcement has ever intimidated me over, standing with a client or advocating for a position. And having dealt with CBP and ICE for a number of years now, I can tell you those agencies are the most likely to be the most intimidating, because they believe they're vested with the most authority. And that's a very scary proposition. That's stuff from Stalinist Russia. That's
Let me
stuff.
throw this out real quick. Let's kill all the lawyers, right? That's Dick the Butcher and Shakespeare's Henry VI, I believe.
Yeah.
And I think that the point really, and lawyers should, I think, see that statement not as ripping on us, but identifying the importance of lawyers and commitment to rule of law for a just society. The
Yes.
idea of let's kill all the lawyers is we'll take down the guardians of rule of law, we'll create chaos, and we will essentially coup, right?
And for whatever reason right now, the immigration issue, this has been an issue in our country since the inception of our country. But
Right.
for right now, in this time period that we're in, it's a really hot button issue, and it drives people to strong opinions. And the political environment is so toxic, and there
Sure.
are so many more calls to violence than I ever remember growing up.
Right.
And it's what kind of society are we going to have if attorneys are afraid to go to court to argue for constitutional rights and violations of constitutional process?
Well, Trump says all the time, it's one of his lines, we're not going to have a country if A, B, C, or D, right? It's part of his sales pitch, the fear-based sales pitch. And I hesitate to kind of invoke that similar thing, but I find that to be actually very true about what's happening now with the compromising of lawyers, inducing fear into lawyers who are supposed to be bold, stalwart, protectors of rule of law. Now that's aspirational. We should not let our egos get away from us. And in fact, we should be very humble right now, because part of what's happening now, I think, is due to our silence on some issues, not ours necessarily, but broad silence on issues when we should have spoken up. So kind of first they came for us. Well, they didn't come for us first, but they're coming for us now. And that is true.
I think if you look at some of the other cases, the student Mahmoud, and I'm losing his last name,
Khalil, I think.
Khalil, he was detained by ICE as he was walking into his naturalization
Mm,
proceedings. And so,
right,
not only are you frustrating the purpose or intimidating those who have a legal pathway to citizenship, and you hear all the taglines, "I don't mind immigration if you do it the right way." He was literally walking into that hearing to complete the process, and he was detained, presumably because he was very outspoken because, on his pro-Palestinian support.
right,
Uh, Free speech is now in question because there are people who have visas who are essentially being silenced in a very general way.
right,
The Constitution grants due process to all persons within the United States borders, not just to citizens. And all of these things are spurring up because of a I would I don't a class. When I say a class, I mean people who don't have citizenship, who one would think who was trying to take advantage and use an expansive uh, make this expansive effort of governmental control,
right.
um, a, a class that should not have as many rights or would be perceived not to have it, and using that world or using that lens, you can chip away at free speech. If you
Sure.
don't have free speech, students are losing their visas right now. If you don't have certain documents in place, you're going to be sent to a prison in El Salvador, and then the question is where does it stop? How fast?
Let me stop you there for a moment, just because we're right at the end of things. And I wish we could get into birthright citizenship because I think that's a huge part of this. But certainly, I think if people are watching this, they should look into that. Very briefly, if you got a quick thing to say for the public or for lawyers that's uplifting in like 15 seconds, give me something, then we got to close.
You want me to go first?
Sure, go ahead.
Did that count for my 15 seconds?
Aasim, you're up now. We're at the end. I'll come back to if we have a second.
Okay.
What should lawyers do?
Fight. Fight for your clients. Go to court. This is
Good.
why you became a lawyer. I told somebody this the other day. We're living in times that are why you became a lawyer, and it's up to
Exactly.
us to go speak. And if we don't go speak, we're the ones that are going to be blamed most of all for the loss of the rights that we've held so dear for so
Truly.
long, and so many have
Truly.
fought so hard to protect. And
Yeah.
it's on all of us.
Well,
We can't just sit and wait for the government. It's on all of us. So let's do it.
right. Well, with that, Aasim, you got something? Go ahead. We got to close.
Core values is if we are going to take a loss, and hopefully we don't, we're going down kicking and swinging, so that the next time a bully comes around, they remember and think about whether or not the fight is worth it.
Absolutely. It does take some moral courage, and it's tricky and it's tough, but the clients and the public need it. And this is our time to kind of stand up. And it was probably before, but it absolutely is now. So thank you, gentlemen, for all your work and for being here. And thank you for tuning in, the public, to this episode of You and the Law.